Hey guys, it's Ted Bogert with the Ted Show. We're back with an old friend, a great friend of the show, a great friend of mine, Dave Benson with DJ Benson and Associates this year. We're going to talk about his new podcast, Believe What You See and Hear. And I want you guys to, I love the title of this, by the way, so I can't wait to take a deep dive. Dave is I'll let you correct me if I'm wrong, but a workplace violence prevention and threat management expert. And he is just a joy to have on, and I can sit and listen to him for hours. I bet you I would love to hear lots of his stories. So welcome back, Dave. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me back, Ted. Hi, everybody.
I'm super excited. I am happy and proud of you for doing a podcast. I think that's amazing. But before we get into that, give them a little background on you, some of your experience and what it really means to be a threat management expert, workplace violence prevention expert. You do all the stuff that we talk about a lot, but you've been in the throes of it. So I'll let you take it over.
Absolutely. I'll give you the Reader's Digest version because it's only a 30-minute show. 40 years as a security professional in some way, shape, or form, about 8.5 years with the Walt Disney Company here in sunny Orlando in the security division, followed by about 23.5 years with the U.S. State Department, Diplomatic Security Service. For those that might not be familiar with DS, with the security and law enforcement arm, I had 4 overseas tours during my career in Egypt, Sri Lanka, Finland, and Bangladesh. I retired as a director of the Diplomatic Security Training Center in Washington, D.C. In 2007. I have been a consultant ever since, both on my own with DJ Benson and Associates, but also with the Center for Personal Protection and Safety. In other groups, workplace violence prevention, mitigation is really something I spend a lot of time on. And more recently, Ted, threat assessment and threat management. Why do people do what they do? What's the difference between making a threat as opposed to posing a threat? It's just been a real blessing and a joy. And frankly, this pandemic period has kind of allowed me to branch out a little bit, hence the podcast.
So I have many questions. When you came on the show the first time, we talked, there was a lot going on. We had just had some major workplace violence. There was just so much going on in the world. And of course, it continues to get, people are getting, pandemic has certainly impacted our psyche. And then of course, you add in all of the things that have transpired because of social media and video, throw the elections on top of it, and it has just been a recipe for some very, very vocal and very physically violent things going on in our country. So talk a little bit about what you do on the workplace side and on the threat management side, because I think people are fascinated by it. They see what they see maybe on Law & Order SVU or in a movie. Tell them if that's real or not, and then give them an example of what you're dealing with right now.
Sure. So first and foremost, I like to tell friends and clients that people just don't snap. That's a misnomer. Almost always there's milestones along the way from a behavioral standpoint. It almost always manifests itself in a change in behavior. And so when we're talking about workplace violence prevention, we're trying to train people to recognize signs and symptoms of people that may have changed. Maybe they're agitated. Maybe they've had some challenges in their life, and what possibly could cause them to go from thoughts to violence, both in the workplace but everywhere. And under its most extreme, threat assessment and threat management is what happens if you have somebody that you feel is acting out. Frankly, maybe it's a neighbor, maybe it's a colleague, maybe it's a talk show host. I don't want to mention any names. Whatever it might be, the behavior is such that people are concerned and they don't know what to do about it. So we know that bad behavior builds upon more bad behavior. So with that being the case, we want to be able to recognize what we call behaviors of concern. What do we do with those? That multiple behaviors of concern can lead to an increased incidence of violence. And then sadly, in the extreme case, if it's left unchecked, we can have acts of extreme violence, whether it be armed assailant, active shooter, domestic violence spillover, whatever that might be. So threat assessment helps to determine if the likelihood that someone is going to commit a violent act, and then threat management is what are you going to do about it?
And I feel like people don't know. They get confused. I love what you said about the fact, say it again, about how people don't just snap, that it is a buildup, because I think a lot of people see signs, but they either don't know how to recognize them or don't know what to do about them if they see them.
Yeah, that's a great point. So the first thing is what are you recognizing? We call it baseline, steady state behavior. How is Ted Bogert normally? What's changed about Ted over a period of time that have caused people to be concerned, or Dave Benson, for whatever that might be? And when you take up multiple different kinds of changes in behavior, agitation, blaming others for their problems, victimization, all these sorts of things, then we begin to be concerned because it's constituting a change in someone's behavior. What should you do? Well, if you're in the community, you need to let the police know. If you're in a work environment, I help train organizations to recognize these behaviors, and it's a balancing act. So we just don't want to penalize people for bad behavior. We want to find out why they're acting that way, get them some help that they might need, and the idea is to avoid them harming themselves or others. And so that's the whole essence of workplace violence prevention, recognizing behaviors of concern. How do you respond to it? And then hopefully intervening in such a way that will either mitigate or avoid a tragedy.
Have you seen a spike, Dave, because of the pandemic and all of the furloughed, people who've lost their jobs, lost their businesses? Have you seen an increase or a spike because of the pandemic?
I think in general terms, we would say yes, but the types of violence that's manifesting itself can be very different. I mean, for example, I'm not a superstitious guy, but I'm trying to knock on something resembling wood. We haven't had a mass shooting since March. Wow, what a coincidence. Has that got something to do with the pandemic and everybody being home? Probably, particularly schools being out. But what we have seen an increase of things like people that are potential or current domestic violence victims. Normally, they would know who to reach out, how to have support mechanisms. Maybe now they're stuck in the house with the person that's abusing them. That's a problem. So in some jurisdictions, we've had a real decrease in the amount of calls for help, whether it be with Harbor House or the police or whatever for potential victims. Sometimes we have more. It really does depend on the circumstances. The other phenomenon that I think is really interesting, I just came out of a seminar this morning discussing this. We've got a couple of reactions to this pandemic. One is, oh my goodness, I'm going to be locked up, and I'm going to be locked up with my family. Are you kidding me? How am I going to be able to survive that for months at a time? And then we have some of us who are actually extreme introverts that are like, I've been doing this for 50 years. What's your problem? The less people I have to be around, the better. So it's kind of a mix. But the more that we go through this process, Ted, the more we get conflicting information on what's the appropriate thing to do and how to respond, that frustration spills over. Two big cases in point. Masks. There have been so much increased violence over whether or not you should wear a mask. You're an idiot if you don't. You're afraid if you do. And we've actually had some acts of violence over that around the country. So then the other situation, you tie the election into that. Should we vote? Can we vote by mail? Is it dangerous? Are we going to be able to have our voices heard? All these things have this toxic cocktail. So what I tell my clients is we want to be mindful of some of the challenges. We want to control the things in our lives we can control, and don't spend an awful lot of time worrying about stuff that we can't control, because that's what causes us stress. Stress builds up over time. And so that's the concern.
I love that. I'm so glad you brought up the masks. I don't want to talk about the issue itself, but I do want to. I saw someone say something to someone at a grocery store, and I got really worried because they went off on each other, and it looked like it could have escalated over one comment about, wow, I wish you would have worn your mask. And it just, people are on edge. Remember, guys, people are on edge, furloughed, restaurants closed, having to be in close quarters. I mean, our whole world shut down and changed overnight, it felt like. And so people are on edge. So I understand you might have an opinion on something. I want to encourage you to be real careful about who you say it to and when, because you never, especially in that scenario, right? You wouldn't necessarily have seen the sign that this guy had it all building up, or this girl, and snapped in the Publix. You wouldn't have been in the workplace. You would have just been the victim of it, or on the receiving end of it. And I think people need to be very, very, very careful about how they challenge people, because you don't know what that person is capable of right at that moment. All right, I have to ask you, your podcast. So what was the impetus behind you creating Believe What You See and Hear? I absolutely love the play on this, because obviously we've all heard, well, you don't always want to believe what you see and hear. You don't always want to believe what you hear. And so talk about how you came up with the idea for the podcast.
So ever since I can remember, I've developed the terminology, believe what you see and hear, but it's with an important caveat. Within the context of knowledge is power, Ted. The more you know, the better you are equipped as a human being to make some decisions on your behalf, on behalf of your family, on behalf of your organization. Not just blame the police, not just blame the city government, not blame your employer, but be an educated consumer of this information and then make some determinations on your own what makes the most sense. So when you do that, you then have the liberty to believe what you see and hear based upon your knowledge and make some informed decisions. So yeah, it is a play on words, and it's turned out to be quite catchy, and people are always wondering what the world that title's about.
So why did you decide to do a podcast? Why now? And what are you trying to accomplish? Because I think everybody starts out with an idea for a podcast. They've got an idea, they've got expertise, or they have a topic that they really feel is important that they can talk about. What was your reason for it?
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of misinformation out there, particularly in the safety and security field. We tend to go to extremes, whether it's political or your personal situation. We either go too far, as our friends across the pond say, over egg the omelet. I love that expression. Where we do little or nothing, and neither one really solves that problem. So the idea is to take fairly complex issues and break them down into their simplest terms, and hopefully make them easily digestible for my audience. My audience, hopefully, will be everyone. I want to take complex issues, for example, de-escalation. 10 years ago, if I said, Ted, I want to come on your show and talk about de-escalation, you'd go, great, but why? What do we need to de-escalate? Now it's whether you're in an altercation with the police, or the police are with you, or you're in a grocery store and someone's wearing a mask or refuse to wear a mask or whatever. How do you mitigate that situation so you don't, number one, make it worse? And then number two, here's some helpful tools in your toolbox to avoid it to begin with, and you gave the best one. Mind your own business, right? And so one of the things I'm teaching my business clients is, do not mandate your employees to enforce your mask rules. That is not fair. They're not equipped to do it. They need to just report it when someone's not following the guidelines, and then you'll make some determinations who should deal with that, because that's how people get hurt and killed. The final thing I'll say about de-escalation is people tend to escalate, not de-escalate. If I screamed at you back in the old days in the Citrus Club, you'd scream back at me, and we'd get louder and louder and louder, and we wouldn't accomplish much. When in fact, we need to stay calm. What I say is, if we can't control ourselves, we can't begin to control a potentially volatile situation. So again, it goes back to self-empowerment, be informed, know what to say, what not to say. So de-escalation is an example of that. Another example might be, it's more timely, how to survive if you find yourself in a riot or a demonstration. Who knew until recently in the City Beautiful this would be a prevailing issue? Well, we've had those issues. So I talk about that hopefully in simplest terms, not whether or not you should go demonstrate. We want to support your constitutional right to do so. But if you get stuck in one that turns violent, what in the world do you do or not do to get you and your loved ones out of harm's way. So those are a couple of examples on what that might be like. The other thing,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
The other thing I'm going to do is interview other subject matter experts. As much as I love to hear myself talk, it occurs to me there's other people around the world that I've been blessed to work with over the last 40 years that have certain areas of expertise. And so we'll mix some of those in. I'll have set questions for folks, and we'll have an interesting session there on different types and aspects of safety and security. Travel safety will be another one. So I've got a lot. I've got 3 in the can.
Good. That's excellent, Dave. Congratulations.
One brief introductory one's a couple of minutes long that I would encourage people just to do a test run on. And then the other 2 are about 20, 30 minutes long. And we're going to keep popping those things out, every week or every other week. And we'll see where we go from there.
So I want to ask you about the de-escalation. I think this is such a critical topic, and I could spend an entire show on this, because I think one of the big mistakes, and I want you to correct me as the expert if my stuff's wrong. I feel like one of the biggest mistakes is people believe that other people are going to react the way that they want them to, and instead of the way that the person is feeling. So if I'm yelling at you trying to get across my point, and then you start yelling at me, I'm actually not expecting that, because I think I'm right, and you're going to listen to me and you're going to agree with me. It's the weirdest thing. And so you go into it and then you yell back at me. Well, now I'm really ticked off. Now I'm really mad. So I have stopped listening to you. You stopped listening to me. And it just gets, I call it frothy. It's like, the mad dog, the old frothy dog. It just becomes this escalated situation that could have just been stopped, or at least, as you said, mitigated, if one person had stepped back for a second and not allowed the escalation to continue. Why do you think that we have to, or why do you think that we get into that situation so much?
Yeah, that's a great point. So I'll briefly go through this. Number one, active listening is not waiting for your turn to speak. But that's what we tend to do, particularly if we have a chronic case of what I call the yeah buts. You're trying to explain your issue, and I'm like, yeah, but you know what you need to do? I'm a subject matter expert. I'll fix you if you'll just be quiet for 5 minutes, and the next thing you know, everything erupts. Comment number 2, and I've mentioned it before, you have to control your own emotions. If you're already angry, don't try to de-escalate somebody else that's angry. It will not end well. Number 3, let people talk. Give them a hearing. We call it psychological air. It doesn't cost you a dime. And guess what? You might learn something. You might figure out what their beef is, and you might be able to help them with the problem. And then the final issue is, don't fix them. Don't try to fix them, which is hard for the male persuasion of the species, as we know. We're fixers. So listen, see if you can help. If you can, help them find a solution. And in the meantime, here's the key on how I teach de-escalation as opposed to others. Have an exit strategy. What if it doesn't work? What if you don't want to hear what I have to say? What if you've already made up your mind? I need to have an exit strategy, and try to let somebody know that I've gotten into this situation with someone. The final piece is, in a work environment, if the person that's angry works for you, quit trying to discipline them in the middle of the argument. Calm them down first. Okay? A calm demeanor will make all the difference in the world. So that's just some of the tips that we talk about. I do it for organizations, but the podcast goes over some of those. And let's face it, Ted, this might be helpful when you sit down with Uncle Ted at the Thanksgiving dinner table that everybody argues with about politics. So it's just in general, relationally, we need to learn to be better listeners and to try to have a calming impact and not take everybody on.
So you really segued perfectly into my next question, is how does it work at the Benson household when you have an expert in de-escalation and you and Dorothy are arguing? Maybe you never argue, I don't know. But I think a lot of people are hearing this and I'm thinking, oh God, Stacy pushes my buttons and I try not to escalate, but it escalates. I mean, these are the things. You mentioned domestic violence earlier, not that that's in either of our households, but this is what happens. People get in arguments and then they begin to have to make their point. And then they begin to push the person's button and say the exact thing that's really going to tick them off. How does that work in a relationship side when you've got the dude that wants to fix it? a lot of times. And then you've got my Stacy says all the time, I just need to vent. Well, oh, Dorothy says I'm watching. Hi, Dorothy.
Yeah.
So how does that work? How can we also translate that into our relationships, into our family and friend relationships?
Well, first of all, the Benson household is unique because everybody in the Benson household is an authority. Just ask them. And even the lovely Katie at 29 is very well learned. It takes that maybe too much after her father with her sarcastic wit. But all kidding aside, yeah, let people vent. I did that twice the hard way with young Dorothy Benson when we were first married. She came home from a job. She was venting. I kept interrupting and saying, how can I fix it? How can I fix it? And one of the only times she ever raised her voice to me was say, Dave, just be quiet and let me talk. I want to vent. So being a reasonably intelligent guy, you would think I'd figure that out, right? So 6 months later, we had another one of these episodes, and I interrupted her again, and I said, so am I fixing or am I listening this time? Believe me when I tell you, listening will carry so much more. Don't judge. Don't try to fix. A lot of times people just want to be understood. They don't want to be agreed with. That's a misnomer. But they do want to be understood, and you have to practice some empathy. There's also a term and a tool called now I've lost it because I'm a senior guy, but it'll come back to me. But it's you're empathic and you act like you're empathic, even if you don't feel like it. Oh, projected sincerity. There's my word. So you know who the best people who have PhDs in projected sincerity? Teenagers. And I know you a little bit about that. I do too. What do I mean? Dad, I know I came home late last night. I blew curfew for the third time in a month. I don't blame you and Mom for being angry. And you know what? I've learned my lesson. I'm never going to do that again until I do. To find it, that's apparent sincerity. But on the positive side, when someone's angry and they want you to help them, you need to give them the semblance of undivided attention. Not so much that you're going to harm yourself. You don't want to get it wrapped into it. Next thing you know, you're in a hostage situation. But you want to be able to be empathic enough to make them understand that you care. That's a critical point in all interpersonal relationships, and particularly in leadership roles. If you lack empathy, if you're too busy for someone, that's just a recipe for disaster down the road in the relationship.
I agree. I also I tell people, is what you need to say really going to make a difference, or when you say it, is it just going to be a match to the fire? So I try to encourage people to think before they speak, because we don't always have to know your opinion. It isn't that critical sometimes. Sometimes you just have to let the other person vent, and you have to be there for them, be an empath, like you said, be empathetic and compassionate. But I have seen more people get in arguments and fights and see things escalate because the other person had to tell them what they were doing wrong, or they had to tell them what they needed to say. And afterward, I'm like, did that make any difference at all? Did it help in any way, shape, or form? And I realize that's easy to say when you're not in the throes of a passionate argument, but I just wish more people would take a step back. All right, so Dave, how do people watch, listen to, get in touch with you and see your awesome podcast?
So right now we have a website up and running, which is, ironically enough, believewhatyouseeandhear.com. I'm not the most creative guy in the world. We try to keep it simple. Right now, that's where we're hanging all the episodes. Down the road, we'll put them on some of the other services. But if you go to believewhatyouseeandhear.com, I'm also going to put all my public appearances. As you know, I've been blessed to be on shows like yours and some media outlets. We'll put those on there as well. And should people want to be able to see those. My website for DJ Benson and Associates is securingsouls.com. And feel free to jump on that. And right now, I welcome questions, comments, virtual rotten fruit, whatever anybody has about the podcast, because we're learning on Twitter, which is DJ Benson1 right now. So that's the primary function for that.
Fantastic. All right, my friend, always a pleasure to have you on. I'm super excited for you and your podcast. Congratulations. Thanks for all you do to help keep our world safe. Give Dorothy a hug from me. You guys reach out to Dave. He is, for what he does, he's one of the calmest, most calming souls to be around. And so he can speak to this and really educate you. Great speaker at any kind of event. And the education that he provides is much, much needed right now. So thank you so much. We will see you guys later. Thanks so much, Dave Benson, for being on the show.
Thank you, Ted. All the best. And to everybody, believe what you see and hear.
Absolutely.